All right, now for the bacteria and archaea groups. So this is the overall phylogeny. Now this isn't the perfect and updated version of this phylogeny, however. This is the one that is covered in your textbook. So of course there is a universal ancestor, and that's an ancestor to everything, right? So remember, bacteria and archaea are the prokaryotes. However, archaea are more closely related to eukaryote. You can see they're in the same monophyletic group here, and then bacteria are kind of on their own. Now, looking a little bit further at this, we can see that eukarya and archaea had diverged at some point, and then eukarya are basically the subject of the next few chapters that we'll be covering. But today we'll be dealing with the archaea and the bacteria. So you can see there are 5 major groups of bacteria, and these are the major groups you want to include in your lab manual when in that table at the end where it asks for the major group that it belongs to. It's going to be one of these 5. And you may need to do a little bit of searching. So for bacteria, there's the proteobacteria, which is where the mitochondrion is suspected to have arisen from one of those groups. And the chlamydias and the spirochetes, the cyanobacteria, and the gram-positive bacteria. So remember the gram stain. So the gram-positive bacteria are all gram-positive, of course. Now, if they're not gram-positive, they may or may not be gram-negative. So most likely they are gram-negative, or they do not stain using the gram stain, right? So it doesn't work. It's inconclusive. And then we have the archaea. So we have the euryarchaeota or euryarchaeotes. We have the thomarchaeota. We have the agarchaeota, we have the crenarchaeota, and the chorearchaeota. Now I say archaeota, but archaeotes and archaeota are the same thing. So you may hear me kind of say the suffix of the term a little bit differently than one might show in the textbook. Don't worry about it, it means the same thing. Now, let's look at bacteria first. Bacteria, the first major group that we'll be discussing is the proteobacteria. Divide up into further groups: alpha, beta, gamma, delta, and epsilon, right? So we're going to look at some examples and characteristics of each one of these groups. Okay, so the proteobacteria, these are gram-negative bacteria, and this includes many different nutritional categories. They could include photoautotrophs, the chemoautotrophs, and some heterotrophs. Some of them are anaerobic and some of them are aerobic, and again, there are 5 subgroups. Now, for the whole group, proteobacteria, nothing here is special and distinguishes each from one another because there's so many different nutritional categories and metabolic categories. However, what's common amongst all of them is that they are gram-negative. Individual groups. So alpha proteobacteria. Most of these are associated with eukaryotic hosts, and it's the alpha bacteria, proteobacteria, that the mitochondrion is suspected to have evolved from. So it's thought that one of the earlier eukaryotic ancestors engulfed a alpha proteobacterium, and now it's the mitochondrion. Now, let's see, here's an example. We saw an example of the rhizobium, which creates those root nodules at the roots of plants. So you can see that, again, they are quite diverse in terms of metabolic and nutritional categories. Remember, the rhizobium can fix nitrogen gas into ammonia, which helps the plants, right? So it's basically a symbiotic relationship with plants. Another example that falls into this particular category are the agrobacterium. These actually produce tumors, and often one example would be the crown gall disease in plants. Interestingly, they do produce tumors, so they over-replicate, really, but they are used in genetic engineering of plants. So the genome of agrobacterium are quite important for practical uses, that is. Now, moving on to the subgroup, the beta proteobacteria subgroup. This one is quite diverse nutritionally as well. Now, One example would be Nitrosomonas, which is a bacteria that's found in soil. It can actually convert the ammonia to nitrates. Now, some of them are aquatic and some of them are pathogenic. So again, they would be considered a pathogen, so they're going to cause disease. Not all of them do this. For gamma proteobacterium, so there are some that are heterotrophic and some that are autotrophic. One example of autotrophic is the purple sulfur bacteria called Thiomargarita namiensis. And then we have some of the examples of heterotrophs are generally pathogenic, so they cause disease, especially in humans. Those examples of diseases or genus that cause disease are Legionella, the Salmonella, and the Vibrio cholera. E. coli or Escherichia E. coli is not normally pathogenic, but it can be pathogenic in high numbers. So this gamma proteobacteria subgroup of the proteobacteria group can be quite dangerous. Now we have the delta proteobacteria. These are slime-secreting myxobacteria. They produce myxospores, which are drought-resistant, so that's kind of a benefit for them. So they actually almost appear like fungi, and you're going to see when we get to that chapter, some fungi actually produce these types of, or they look like these spore-like structures. So Adelovibrio is an example one which actually mounts high-speed attacks on other bacteria. Here's another one, Myxococcus xanthus. This actually is a bacteria that work with one another to attack prey, and they're kind of swarming as well. So someone actually, I think a scientist who discovered them, they described it as the wolf pack, and that's kind of referring to a movie that you might be familiar with. Interestingly, they secrete antibiotics and enzymes that actually kill their prey. So, and again, they can digest them once the prey are. Now, the epsilon proteobacteria can also cause disease as well. These are going to be pathogenic, similar to the beta proteobacteria. A couple examples are Campylobacter jejuni. This one causes blood poisoning, and Helicobacter pylori, which causes stomach ulcers. So you might have heard the shortened version of that, H. pylori. So this is that example, and here's an image of that organism. So the next major group, so we talked about proteobacterias and the subgroups. Now we're moving on to chlamydias. These are generally parasitic. Some of them cause disease. Some of them actually cause sexually transmitted disease, and you might have heard the term chlamydia, but not all of them are sexually transmitted. So it's important to remember that when you see chlamydias, it's not always just the organism that causes that disease in humans. But this particular disease is the one, this example you could see of this in an animal cell. It's sexually transmitted, and it can cause blindness and of course, urinary tract infections. Spirochetes. Spirochetes is another major group of bacteria. These are helical in format, so they have this helix type structure. They are generally gram-negative and they're heterotrophic. Some examples are pretty dangerous. They also cause disease, right? So we have Treponema pallidum. This causes syphilis, and Borrelia burgdorferi. This one causes Lyme disease. Now, the cyanobacterium are quite different from the rest of them. These are also gram-negative bacteria. They are actually photoautotrophs. So these can generate oxygen because they can photosynthesize. It's suspected that the chloroplast in plants evolved from a cyanobacterium. So again, an earlier ancestor of plants probably engulfed a cyanobacterium. Now it is the chloroplast inside plants, so it's an organelle. But cyanobacteria still exists today, just a different type, right? So oscillatoria, here you can see one example of a filamentous type of cyanobacterium. So they have different structures. Some of them form filament-like structures. And then we have the gram-positive bacteria. Many of these are quite dangerous. So we have those that form colonies and those that are more solitary. An example of one that forms colonies is actinomyces. This one's quite interesting. It actually produces an antibiotic, which is quite important. This one can decompose organic matter, and here's an image of it here. And then some examples of solitary species of the gram-positive bacteria include the Bacillus anthracis, which is the organism that causes anthrax, Clostridium botulinum, which causes botulism, and then we have the Staphylococcus and the Streptococcus species, which belong to these groups as well. So these are all going to be gram-positive bacteria. So you would expect them to stain dark purple after you stain them using the differential gram stain. Now, another example of another gram-positive bacteria is a mycoplasma. This is actually one of the smallest known cells. This actually doesn't have a cell wall. So, yes, we were calling it a gram-positive bacteria. It doesn't have a cell wall. If you think of the process for the gram stain, it's not identified in that way. It's identified by genomic studies. So genomic studies have placed it in more closely related to the gram-positive bacteria than it is to any of the other bacteria. So the bacteria are actually these small little particles that are actually on an animal cell. So this is a human fibroblast cell, and you can see the hundreds of mycoplasmas that are on the surface of that cell. So you can imagine how small they are. Right. So this kind of goes back to the overall phylogeny, and we can see the phylogeny. This is simplified, of course, the phylogeny of prokaryotes, and then in their relationship to eukaryotes. Let's move on to the archaea. Now, there isn't much information about archaea in your textbook. New things are being discovered all the time, so really, that's lucky for you. You don't really need to know as much information about the archaea as you do each of the groups of bacteria. All right, so the archaea, again, little is known, and here we've got this recently discovered Loci-archaeota, which isn't actually in that phylogeny that I just showed you. It's thought to be the sister group of eukaryotes. Now, if we look at this tree right here, we've got the archaea right here, the tac group, and then a different kind of orientation of this phylogeny shown in this image. However, you can see the Loci-archaeota more closely related to eukarya. And remember, archaea are closely related to eukarya, but this one, it looks like it's a sister group. So it's really almost like that link to the archaea. Very, very closely related. It kind of links them a little bit better. Now, this is a publication in Science Mag that I kind of pulled up the phylogeny. You can see there are many subgroups of each of these major groups of archaea. So there is a lot of organisms that have been studied, and their evolutionary relationship between each other have been identified. I just kind of wanted to show you that. If you want to look further into it, you're more than welcome to click on this link and go ahead and visit that article if you can access it. If you can't, please contact me and I will attempt to access it through my credentials. All right, in summary, we've pretty much completed the bacteria and archaea chapter 27. If you had done these in order, this should be the final segment. I just basically talked about the groups and subgroups of bacteria and a brief introduction to archaea. There's a little bit more information in your lab manual, so I would pay attention to the lab manual and all the details in there for your lab